Hello there. This beautiful beast is Cronon. He belongs to my mother-in-law. And he helps me think about chess. He's great. So Cronon, you stay there. Okay, and I'll carry on with this. Now, recently I was oh, what's he doing now? I think he's okay. So recently I was asked about strategy for black when playing the Sicilian Kalashnikov. Let's put that on the board. So there we go, an open Sicilian, and knight b5 is the best move here, although not everyone plays that. And then how should black play against this Marozzi? So what I thought I'd do is I'd look at a game played just a few weeks ago in the Tata Steel Challengers. And this is an excellent illustration of black's strategy and what black is trying to achieve. Remember, if you'd like to know more about the Sicilian Kalashnikov, then do buy my book from New in Chess, or you can get the Chessable course online. And there you'll find video explanations, and there's also variation repetition to help you remember the lines. And I'll put the links below for both those. So playing white in this game is Carissa Yip. She's 22 years old, rising fast, has a live rating of 2485, currently the top rated woman in the USA. Playing black, Aydin Suleymanli from Azerbaijan, 20 years old, with a current rating of 2628. He came third in the Challengers tournament with the excellent score of 9 out of 13. And he's clearly great talent, great prospect for the future. And he's just crept into the top 100 in the world. And it's great to see him playing the Kalashnikov. Right, let's crack on with the game. So, how should black tackle this Marozzi? Well, you can see that by playing c4, white gains more control over the d5 square. That's the good news from white's viewpoint. But there is a problem as well, that this square can no longer be protected by a pawn, so black is often able to use the d4 square. That's the problem. Now, in the old days, players used to push that knight back and simply play knight f6 and bishop e7 and so on. But in the last few years, g6 has taken over as the main move. So the bishop is going to sit on g7. Now, it doesn't look like it does much there because it's blocked in. Let's just go on a few moves. So the knight is pushed back, of course, first, and then bishop g7. Now, it's blocked in by the pawn on e5. However, it does support a knight when it wants to come into d4. So that's very important. Knight d5, there we go. So white occupies the d5 square. And generally it's best to put that knight on f6 in this variation, as we'll see. This knight has some nice ideas. So knight c3, which defends the pawn. And knight d4 straight away. There we go. Now we can see the downside of playing this pawn to c4. That knight comes into the d4 square. In the course, I call this the Trojan horse. It's often the start of complications. You know, it's very difficult for white to know how to deal with this knight well. So already you're asking your opponent questions. So Yip decides to just move the bishop out of range of the knight. And it's true that if black can exchange off knight for bishop, then often it means that these pawns are less secure. It's easier for black to hit out. So bishop d3 keeps guarding the e4 pawn. Now, I think black actually has a very easy time if this is exchanged. This didn't happen. So, for example, c takes, bishop d7. This knight, you can see the point of putting the bishop here on g7. It gives more cover for that knight on d4. I think black has a very easy game there. Or if knight takes, I think that's a very safe way for black to play. I think white is going to have to get rid of that knight. And then we get a position which is just about equal with the opposite colour bishops. Don't think black has any difficulties. But Suleymanli didn't play that. He wanted to keep more tension in the position. I think, he was playing for a win. He's higher rated than Carissa Yip. He wants to keep more tension in the position. So that's why knight d7 was played. And we can see why the knight went on this circuit. Because from d7, that knight can hop into c5 to hassle the bishop, to look at e4. It's just a very nice square. Also, it lets the f-pawn free as well. Now, you have to be very careful when you advance the f-pawn, but it does come into the game sometimes. So Yip decides to play knight e2. You see, already she's thinking, how do I don't want to live with that knight on d4. Whoops. Oh, the cat's having fun. I don't want to live with that knight on d4, so she's going to exchange it off. So, castles. There's no need for black to exchange on e2. And knight takes d4, e takes d4, so this happened. Now, the pawn structure has changed, so we need to just reassess exactly what's going on in this position. This is very dynamic for black, because you can see the bishop, the diagonal of the bishop has increased, so e5 is potentially available. And you never know, if this pawn were to advance, then that bishop would rake across the board. The E file is now open, which could be useful. Well, let's see how this works out in practice. So, knight f4. Hits the bishop, so rook e8. Okay, that's no problem. And b3. Knight c5. So, yeah, I mentioned this already. The knight stands very well on c5, looking at the bishop, but also looking at the e4 pawn. And it's a nice solid square. Bishop b2. And bishop d7. There we go. So because of the exchange on d4, then the e file is opened for the rook. And now there's pressure on the e pawn, which is very nice. Now, yeah, it's interesting. I think Carissa plays a good move here, knight d5. She's very much hoping that this pawn will be taken, because if you see, if this didn't happen, by the way, if this exchange, the rook is pushed back and bishop takes d4. And so white has recovered the pawn, very solid position. This knight is well protected. If the queen reaches d4, you can see the queen and knight really dominate the board. It's going to be very easy to bring up a rook behind the queen on the d file. White is better there. So instead of that, bishop c6. So just keeping an eye on that knight, it could be useful to exchange it off. And, well, sooner or later, this will be a threat. So white is going to have to deal with that e-pawn. How is it to be defended? And I think this is a difficult decision. You could play rook e1, you could play f3, or you could play queen f3. Okay, which of those would you go for? It's not easy. You might think, well, f3 is the simplest, but well, that creates some weaknesses around the king. A simple way to play would just be to do this and queen g5. So obviously that's a threat, but black could start advancing the h-pawn, a very common strategy in these kind of lines. And then who knows, the bishop could hit e5. There could be some pressure on this diagonal. You know, that's nice and active for black. All right, so what about rook e1? Well, that would avoid the problems of weakening the e3 square. But then black could exchange. You can't play e takes because tactically that doesn't work because of the exchange on e1 and you take on d3. So this has to be played. But then f5. Again, because of the tactics on the e file, very nice. White can't exchange on f5 because of rook takes rook and knight takes bishop. So you can see that black has pressure here. So that's why instead of rook e1 or f3, queen f3 played, which feels sounder. But you can see that, you know, pressure is building here. This is nice. You know, the knight stands really well. Now, I think there are several ideas for black here, but rook c8 is sound. You know, that's usually where the rook belongs in these positions in the Sicilian, on the semi-open file. Rook d1, okay, supporting the bishop looks natural and, you know, perhaps trying to get it at this pawn. Now, here is where I'd like you to have a think. I'm going to have a drink. So how do you play here with black? I think there are a number of attractive continuations actually, but how do you play? So black to play. I'll see you in a moment after this message.
I've seen many chessboards in my life, but when I heard about this one, I was keen to see it for myself. It's beautiful and completely wireless, thanks to an integrated battery and Bluetooth connection. For my edition, I wanted pieces that reflect clarity. When I play with them, everything feels natural. Just me, the board, and the game I love. This is my supreme chess set, the Daniel King edition.
What did you come up with? I think black has a few decent ideas here. So, for example, I think a simple way to play for black would be to eliminate that knight at some point. It's going to have to go. Now, if c takes, queen a5. All black's pieces are active here with pressure. And if e takes, then a5 and queen b6 is quite nice. So, you know, black is starting to work away at the queenside. You know, a4 is nice, little bit of play on those dart squares. And again, all black's pieces are active. Very nice position. Indeed, it's possible just to play a5 here straight away. And perhaps next move, bishop takes knight. But Suleymanli played b5. It's hammer time. You've got to break down the walls of Jericho. Hammer away at that Maróczi structure. So this is the classic break for black against the Maróczi. And you see this so often in this variation. So if c takes b5, one could just recapture here. That's possible. But I suspect that Yip didn't want to do this because of this. And bishop takes b5, which, well, basically white can get some decent compensation with bishop takes d4, but it involves giving up material. So instead, after b5, rook e1 was played. Okay, just trying to hold things together. Then bishop takes knight. Whoops, sorry, I've leapt ahead. Bishop takes knight. Now, if e takes, you can exchange and play queen a5. So this is obviously very unpleasant for white. This queen is hitting these 2 points. I mean, there's so much pressure here. So c takes instead. Queen a5 anyway, attacking the a2 pawn. So bishop b1, the bishop drops back to defend. And here again is where black's dynamic chances come into play. It's possible to play f5 actually. Because notice this pin on the E file. But d3 played. This introduces some very interesting complications. So you can see how this bishop on g7, which was blunted by the pawn on e5, has really come into the game. So it was exchanged off. But that means that these dark squares are much weaker, and white is left with this not very good bishop on b1. So bishop takes pawn, getting rid of that advanced pawn, and queen takes a2. You can see that black is just so active here on the queen side, and this pawn is in big trouble. And there's still very nice pressure here. It's very hard for white to get a hit on black's position because the king side is so solid. All black's pieces are active, and it's like you can see that white feels very overextended here. And this is the problem with the Marozzi, or indeed any position where pawns are advanced, that every pawn move creates weaknesses behind it. You can see all the squares behind the pawn on e4, besides as well, e4 and behind the pawn on d5, they're all weak. They can't be protected. Whereas you compare with black's compact structure, more modest, but actually keeps everything tightly defended. So white's in trouble. So b4. Now, it's possible to exchange on d3, but I think in principle it's much better to play knight a4 because that bishop is a bit of a rotten piece. It's blocked in by the pawns. And this knight is hopping around somewhere very dangerous. Queen g3 played, so attacking the pawn here. But knight b2 hits the rook. Rook moved to d2. I mean, it's a difficult position. This is now really tricky, and queen b3. Tactically, white is in massive trouble here because the bishop is hit. The rooks are both unprotected, split rooks. The pawn here is in trouble. Black's pieces, the rooks are connected, they're both active. It's impossible to hold everything together here. So bishop f1, it feels like the right move to tuck the bishop back and to guard the back rank. Yeah, that's another problem that white has, of course, the weak back rank. So at least the bishop blocks out. But simply queen takes b4. Now, black is a pawn up. These two are just waiting in the wings. And there's still pressure on white's position. This is really nice. Queen f4. Protecting the rook. Knight a4, the knight bounces back. Rook e5, that's such a chunky, solid move. I really like that. Shuts the queen out from d6. Prevents the h-pawn advancing. Really nice. f3, knight c3. It's a lost position for white, and after this, there's a very nice tactical finish. Knight takes e4, using that rook on c8. So if rook takes rook, then queen takes, and this is obviously a winning endgame. And otherwise that rook is on prise. So h5, and this was taken. Check. Pawn takes. Well, Carissa is hoping to get in with the queen, but this next move was a killer. Rook f5, just exploiting that pin very nicely, and then the bishop is gone on f1. So very smooth victory, actually. A couple of things to remember with this line against this Marozzi. So e5, knight b5, d6, c4. So remember, that square is weakened. And it's really nice to put the bishop on the long diagonal. And later on, knight d4, very common. The Trojan horse throws in there and just creates confusion, actually. You know, it's difficult to know how to deal with that. And then later on, yeah, it's all about breaking down the walls. It's hammer time. b5 is a very important move in this kind of position to break down the Marozzi structure, although, as I showed, in fact, it's not the only way of dealing with this kind of position. So there you go. If you want to know more, as I said, do check out my book, From New in Chess, or the Chessable course. And otherwise, I'll see you soon. Yeah, actually, I've got a few more Kalashnikov games that I want to actually show you. So, well, we'll see if I can fit that in. See ya.